Legal Systems in a Network Society is our paper that explores the evolution of legal systems as we move into the information age. More specifically, the paper is focused on an analysis of how legal systems will need to evolve in the coming decades if they are to achieve alignment with the emerging next-generation internet. This video gives a high-level overview to the contents of the paper. Law is a very fundamental part of any society. Indeed, much of its origins derive from inherent features of the human condition and fundamental social dynamics that emerge out of social interaction. When humans interact, they become interdependent within some combined organization as the actions of either party affects that of others. And to achieve optimal outcomes, recognized and accepted protocols of behavior are required. Legal systems can thus be defined as the system of rules or protocols that regulate and coordinate human organization. They formally mediate human relations so as to achieve the outcomes that are deemed socially acceptable. Just as political systems span the spectrum from autocratic to democratic, from the rule of few to the rule of many, so too the rules that govern a community span from being designed according to the interests of the few to those that are in the interests of the many. As such, a legal system can be based upon the authority of a subset of the parts in the system, or rules that are designed to achieve optimal coordination for the whole. Legal systems emerge organically out of the underlying social system and are thus very much contingent on the type of underlying social structures and cultural paradigm. For example, with a dominance hierarchy where the underlying social dynamics are conflictual, then structures of authority arise. The rule of law, though, implies that a single set of rules apply to all, independent of their social status or capacity to exert force. The development of such a system requires the deliberative reasoning of social relations and complex issues concerning equality, fairness, and justice. Our capacity to live by the rule of law is thus very much contingent upon human reasoning. The capacity that we have as individuals and whole societies to reason about ourselves, the nature of the world and social interaction, to derive insights from this and base our legal frameworks upon it. In so doing, creating legal systems of logical rules that can overcome the rule of force. The evolution of legal systems traces the history of social organization over thousands of years, as we have attempted to find ever larger, more objective systems for coordinating human activity through shared cultural systems and shared economic and political organization. For most of human history, people have lived in small communities that were shaped by their own specific geography and beliefs. There was no shared ideologies or political units beyond the very local community. For most of history, laws have only applied to a small group of people who were in power, and was excluded from many who they had power over, with slavery being an example of this. These formal legal systems were dependent upon some centralized institution to enforce it, and that institution decided what was law and who was included or excluded from it, with those excluded having virtually no recognizable rights. In the ancient world, laws were not universally applicable. If you were in with the right people, you were safe. If you weren't, you were not. Over the long arc of history, following the development of civilization around the world, the basis for legal systems has gradually shifted from being based upon force to becoming based upon human reason, with a concomitant expansion of rights from the few to the many, as we have gone from small tribes to the modern nation-state, where legal systems coordinate millions of people's interactions within a common legal framework. Certainly, huge progress was made with the expansion of the modern legal system around the world, and out of the ashes of 2 world wars, nation-states formed the United Nations. Their basic purpose was to reaffirm fundamental human rights and develop international law. In the 20th century, great progress was made, but the reality is that rights are still given by national governments and upheld and enforced by them. In the absence of their interest or jurisdiction, they do not really exist in practicality. We do not have protection as individuals without governments, and likewise, we do not have a global legal system without them. In the endless evolution of social organization to new levels of complexity, the question remains, what would a system that was truly global look like, that included all, that did not stop at borders and require the interests of some individual nation to be enforced? Over the course of the current decades, driven by major processes of change, the network society concept is going from a theory to a reality and driving major change and disruption in our systems of social organization. As a consequence of the proliferation of information technology, the expansion of social networking and globalization, once established patterns of political and legal organization are showing signs of failing in the face of new levels of socioeconomic complexity. Today, the legal frameworks that regulate our world are based upon the nation-state or the supranational institutions that they have set up and enforce. The global legal architecture that regulates our world forms a hierarchical structure from the national up to global level. The system is designed to be grounded in the concrete machinery that states have created to make, adjudicate, and enforce laws. Globalization, however, appears to be changing this situation, given the rise of cross-border networks of trade, migration, financial flows, tourism, media, supply chains, and international crime. Environmental governance is but one good example, as it has become a major cross-border issue over just the past decades. The impact of climate change, pollution, declining freshwater supplies, and desertification do not stop at national borders and are not purely domestic. Individual states are very much limited in their capacities to do anything about these issues by themselves, since the cause of specific problems often derive from many other jurisdictions. With an ongoing revolution in information technology, a new kind of law is emerging, the law of technology. Although it has always been there, today it is becoming all-pervasive. As a consequence of major trends, such as urbanization, humanity is moving into an increasingly engineered environment and designed information environment, both of which are architected by humans, and both of which structure and regulate our behavior and activities. We find that the people who are designing software systems are becoming the architects for new kinds of environments and the rules those environments create. Platforms like YouTube and Facebook create a new kind of regulation and have a huge influence on what gets said or not said, what happens and what does not happen. It is apparent that code is becoming law, and that raises major issues as many of our policies and laws were formulated prior to the internet era, and the pace of change has far outstripped the capacities of our legal system to adapt. As a consequence, there is a growing legal vacuum currently in the world relating to technology. Commercial influence is now shaping technology faster than policy and regulation is happening. And this means that the rules that really affect our lives are not being shaped by society at large, but instead by a small minority that sits inside these private enterprises and the minority that understands the technology. Data and information are starting to flow from all directions, and as more and more systems, processes, and organizations become visible to the public, centralized social institutions of the industrial age are losing trust, and trust is a critical infrastructure to the maintenance of any social institution. Parallel to this, new forms of social organization are emerging in a new kind of space that is outside any of the existing jurisdictions, a space that is both everywhere, as it is global, and nowhere, as it is largely just information. Every day, more and more people are choosing to connect into networks that enable social interaction and communications. Ideas are shared, and new kinds of organizations emerge based upon these ideas. Social networks are growing and taking over more and more basic social functions, from how we find our jobs, where we get our news, to how we communicate with our friends. Although to date, the rise of social networking has been somewhat contained within the existing model, increasingly, it is starting to disrupt and destabilize traditional sociopolitical processes. Within our existing model, some centralized organization operates these social platforms, and they will inevitably have an agenda and interest. Whether those are political or commercial agendas, they are not public. These spaces that are starting to coordinate and regulate human interaction are controlled and created by the few, and not by the many that they affect. Legal inclusiveness, likewise, remains a major issue around the world. The very design of our legal systems works to exclude many people from the usage of formal legal mechanisms. The system is simply too costly and overcomplicated to be of use to much of the world's population. Although our legal systems have become ever larger and more sophisticated, they are still far from reaching everyone. Whether by design or intent, our legal systems are on a practical level elitist. They work for a small minority of the world's population that can afford them, while most are left outside. At the end of the day, using the legal system often costs a lot of money. If you do not have it, much of it is of no use to you. It is estimated that some 4 billion people around the world miss the chance to better their lives and climb out of poverty because they are excluded from accessing the rule of law. The question of how to expand our legal infrastructure to deliver an effective service to all on the planet is clearly still an open one. At the same time, we live in an age of huge technological transformation. As we move from the industrial age to the network society, the world is changing, and this change should be seen as an opportunity to rethink the paradigm, to embrace the new technological possibilities so as to take the development of our global legal architecture to a new level. In the coming years, almost all of our systems of organization will migrate to being based on information networks running through the internet, and this will be the same for our legal systems. Added to this, with the rise of decentralized secure computing networks, it is inevitable that in the coming years we will see the emergence of legal systems that are native to the internet. Today, power is once again shifting. It is moving from bureaucratic organizations of all forms to information-based networks. Today, new forms of global information-based networks are forming, through which we are starting to channel human interaction and coordination directly. The drive to build institutions that are aligned with the dynamics of those underlying information networks is mounting, and the frictions created by maintaining the centralized vertical institutions is rendering them less effective. Upgrading our legal systems and starting the long process of bringing them in line with the transition into the network society is of critical importance. If traditional legal systems wish not to be bypassed by new internet-native legal systems, that will result in mounting tension and growing conflicts. These information network-based legal systems will look very different to the centralized systems we know today. We are moving from a model of top-down, pre-specified rules to information networks, where coordination is achieved through peer interaction, as illustrated by the social networks of today. These institutions will shift from the realm of the physical to the information, from bureaucracies and vertical flows to automated networks of horizontal interaction. Legal systems are ultimately about trust and cooperation that leads to order. This can be achieved through traditional vertical structures, but without those, it essentially becomes a game theoretical challenge. How do we get the agents in the system to act in a way that is cooperative with others and the whole social system? Instead of focusing on the centralized institutions through which we specify rules and impose them, the question turns to how do we get cooperation in a network of interacting agents? This distributed model is grounded in a recognition that the legal system is ultimately about social cooperation, which can be understood as a kind of value. We call this value that enables cooperative behavior social capital. Social capital is the capacity for people to come to a consensus and act in a cooperative fashion that is best for all. This term gives us a more fluid, granular, and quantifiable way of talking about cooperation within social groups. In this way, we can see that justice and order can be achieved really in two different ways, by either focusing on maintaining it through the development and application of rules of law via formal institutions, or by creating the grounds within society for cooperative outcomes so that issues of injustice are less likely to occur in the first place, because people live in environments that incentivize cooperative behavior. This second distributed approach is all about building systems or networks within society that foster social capital. The network society shifts the locus of organization from centralized systems out to the individual and the networks that connect them. The model then shifts from trying to concentrate everything in the center and batch processing to instead setting up networks for people to create their own systems of coordination. The legal system of tomorrow will not be like the one-size-fits-all centralized model of yesterday. It will be a more user-centered system, where people create their own rules and negotiate them dynamically and directly within peer networks. With the expansion of social networking and its convergence with legal systems, we will find ourselves living in a world where people can set up their own legal system based upon their own identity, binding themselves into the rules that they choose and choosing the arbitrators that they wish, rather than all of those being defined for them by a centralized fixed institution. In such a world, the challenge is not one of creating and imposing rules, but instead of designing a cooperative system by working with interdependencies that result from transparency and connectivity. A decentralized approach is to give up the one-size-fits-all model based upon the idea that any one of us knows the best option that others should live by. It is to shift that decision to the individual and then recombine people based upon the choices they make within networks. The legal system of tomorrow will not be written down in stone and sit fixed for centuries. It will evolve similarly to the way markets evolve, through user generation and user demands. Indeed, this distributed approach, based upon peer interaction, is largely an extension of the world we live in today. As a consequence of the rise of web technologies, we are being rated and rating other people, products and services. We have a credit rating. We are rated by how good we look on dating sites. We have websites for ranking hotel rooms and restaurants that give book reviews, etc. The key change that comes about is that with the advance of secure computing networks, these social networks of today are no longer confined to the world of entertainment, media, and cultural production, but now have the infrastructure to expand out to more formal domains that require secure, trusted data and value exchange. In the past, this was not possible because the internet did not have built-in security, and all the applications were run by private, for-profit organizations. But with the emergence of a new set of technologies, the internet will be greatly strengthened by the addition of a secure protocol layer, enabling it to support secure distributed networks of organization that no one private entity owns. This emerging form of information systems is one that is decentralized across a network of computers that are incentivized to provide computing resources and operate as a single database or single cloud computer that is distributed out around the world. The best example of these are what we call blockchains. Without centralized authority, coordination within these networks is achieved through the direct exchange of value, peer-to-peer, within market-like structures. These token markets that sit on top of blockchain networks can be used to define anything that is of value within the network. For example, on a social network, this technology can enable the recording and tracking of the exchange of social capital. With secure networks, it is possible for us to record identity on a distributed database and for people to own their own identity. Tokens are used to track the exchange of social capital between individuals and organizations. With the design of game theoretical structures, those tokens can be used to incentivize behavior that leads to cooperative outcomes, while ensuring against deleterious outcomes. Our actions have always had an impact in the world. When we drop litter, when we shout late at night in a built-up area, when a business operates a supply chain dependent upon poor worker conditions. The difference is that in the past, these things were in some way subjective, whereas today, we are making them objective by turning them all into data. The more we datafy things, the more connectivity we have, the more we can move from the traditional physical world into the world of regulation via information networks in a pure fashion. And this is what is happening today. The combination of blockchain networks, datafication, and analytics will take us into a world mediated directly via these networks, and token markets will be the pure signaling medium through which all that is done. The system has to incentivize people towards consensus and ensure that they have skin in the game, that they will lose social capital if they act to break the consensus. The system thus supports order and cooperation by each individual seeing it as in their interest to act cooperatively. The model switches to one where anyone can create their own contractual agreements dynamically as they interact. Everyone has both a stake and part in the network and are incentivized to come to a consensus and follow rules of interaction once agreed. Just as the last generation of web technologies made possible the formation of global-scale social networks and commercial platforms that were native to the internet, bringing disruption to the private sector by making possible the public service provisioning, the next generation will bring disruption to the core social institutions and structures that have regulated mass societies for decades and centuries. The age of a global marketplace for public services that are native to the internet is coming, for legal systems, for public admin, for political processes, for adjudication and enforcement. Some traditional jurisdictions, like Estonia, are already migrating to this new distributed computing platform and using it to provide global public services like citizenship. Already, we see the emergence of new forms of self-sovereign political organizations being created on the decentralized web. The most mature current examples of this include Democracy Earth or BitNation. Projects like BitNation offer peer-to-peer governance services independently from nation-states' jurisdictions, creating a new market for government services. By registering on the app, you can start to make agreements of many kinds on their blockchain. This could include marriage, business contracts, land titles, or certificates. Also, they provide mechanisms for dispute resolution as opposed to going to a government court. The tension between industrial institutions and these new forms of information-based networked organizations has been there for some decades now. But in the past, the two systems of organization lived in two parallel universes with limited direct overlap. Added to this, networked organizations were relatively weak and generally just virtual in nature. This will change in the coming decade as the internet starts to come offline, connected up to autonomous cars, our buildings, urban infrastructure, etc. These networks that have their own secure database and networks for trusted collaboration will build their own rules and likely use physical technology to enforce them as the Internet of Things expands in scope. The two worlds will increasingly start to collide, tensions will mount, and conflicts will inevitably form. Whichever way the legal establishment chooses to respond to this change process, things will evolve fast in the coming decades. Failing to evolve will leave societies divided between the old sources of authority and the new internet-based networks. As the technology and networks mature and are able to take over more critical social functions, that divide will grow stronger. This can be seen as a threat and risk, as it implies years of disruption. But it can also be seen as once again a new opportunity to build new forms of political institutions for realizing justice. But this time, we have the opportunity like never before to extend that to all around the planet. As proliferating global connectivity results in the forming of some kind of global society, only justice can enable us to bridge the divides between people and places. And only a comprehensive and global legal infrastructure can be expected to deliver that. This video has been an overview to our paper on legal systems in a network society. You can download the full paper by clicking the link below.